on primary day, there were about 12 nuns from a convent who were denied the ability to vote. The Missouri legislature was considering the bill within the next 2 weeks, and Robin Carnahan used what happened in Indiana, much to her advantage, and she did press conferences with nuns, and she shut that down. So I think one of the things we have to keep in mind is when we talk about primaries, we're also talking about that system, that flawed system of voting. And very few people know as much about how the system works as the Secretary of State of Missouri. So, Robin?
Thank you very much, Joe, for the invitation to be here, and all of you for coming. You know, I appreciate being here at this blogging conference. It's just been so invigorating to watch the people who really are spurring the public debate in our country and having such an influence. I'll tell you that I am not a blogger myself, but I know one. In addition to Joe, my mother, who is here, former Senator Jean Carnahan, has a blog in Missouri, so thanks for being here with us, Mom. And she keeps me up to date on everything. I have seen, as Joe said, the firsthand power of what the blogging and the Netroots community can do, and this photo ID debate that he mentioned was just such an example. Because of what folks in the Netroots community did by getting the word out about real people that would be disenfranchised by one of these rules that requires a government-issued photo ID in order to vote. Let me be clear, in Missouri and in most other states, you have to show some form of ID to vote. It makes a lot of sense. That's already the rule, but it's not a special government ID, which for a lot of us, if we drive, it's a driver's license, but for many of those folks who don't have driver's licenses, it's very difficult to get. In my state, it would have meant disenfranchising about 270,000 people, so very, very real numbers. And because we were able to highlight this and get stories of real people who would be impacted, we were able to stop that effort in my state. You know, this panel's about reform, and before we can really talk about how to do reforms, we need to talk a little bit about what the process is and how it really works. Obviously, there are problems that we can identify. There's chaos, there's front-loading, there's changing dates, there's obviously issues of fairness, because a person's vote in one state may not be equal to a person's vote in another state, depending on whether they get to even participate in the process or not, depending on when the nominee is selected. It's unpredictable, it's long, it's patchwork, it's no uniformity, and there are all kinds of problems that we can all identify. Interestingly, to me, many of the dire predictions about the front-loading and the impact of that and the money it was going to cost that we all had this year didn't happen. It turned out almost just the opposite. We all thought, and I will tell you I was one, that this would be decided by February 5th.
And your primary was February 5th.
And my primary, the Missouri primary, was February 5th. I thought we'd have a winner. And for a year, and most election officials thought the same thing. There were, 22 elections that day. But it went throughout the primaries, the season, and obviously that was not something any of us predicted. But there are procedural barriers that are out there to fixing all of these problems that I mentioned. The thing to remember when you're talking about elections is kind of like that old admonition of Tip O'Neill that all politics is local. Well, guess what? All elections and all election laws and rules are local. And that means there is a big patchwork. And unless we decide as a people and as a nation that we're going to change that and have a uniform election law across the country, which we've never had in the history of our country, it's going to continue to be this patchwork. There are other kinds of issues, and one is that there are certain things that parties have to deal with and make decisions about, and other things that legislatures and elected officials have to deal with. And we can talk about a few of those. In particular, there's a barrier because changes to the nominating process at the Democratic National Committee level, you can make those changes just about any time through the year, but for the Republicans, they can only make those changes at the Rules Committee at their party convention. So, if anything's going to change for 2012, it has to be changed at the Republican convention this year. So this is a huge barrier. And it's one of the reasons why nothing's happened, because by the time the convention rolls around, everybody's distracted thinking about getting a president elected, not thinking about reforming a process 4 years down the road. I'll tell you that the notion of reform is not something that's very new. We didn't just come up with it in the last couple of years. It's been going on for a long time. Students of history will remember that in the 19th century, taken over the process. And so the first primary happened in 1912, and it was in North Dakota, where people thought it ought not be the politicians, it ought to be voters who got to decide who party nominees were. Even having that happen, it continued to have sort of party bosses in control for a long, long time. And it wasn't until 1960 with John Kennedy when people even more decided they were interested in having direct votes and representation. And then in 1968, I don't know if anybody remembers this, but the nominee that year, Hubert Humphrey, can you tell me, sir, how many primaries he won that year?
I remember getting tear gassed in Chicago at the convention. I don't remember the primaries.
Zero.
Zero.
Hubert Humphrey was nominated as a nominee of the Democratic Party in 1968, having won no primaries. Okay? So that, of course, set off a whole wave of reform to be able to make it so that if you were voted on in a state, you were a pledged delegate for the candidate that was voted for, and that you had to vote that way at the convention. So this demand for reform has sort of continued over time. There's obviously lots of differences in the states. There are 14 states that do caucuses, the rest do primaries. Some of those are open primaries, some of those are closed primaries. The parties try to influence that, but in the end the state parties get to decide on their own how that works. And then obviously a Texas situation that has both. Why all these differences? Well, the first clearly is history. That these things just have developed over time differently with the powers that be in their own states. In Missouri, for example, we had caucuses throughout our history until 1988. And can anybody guess why we changed that in 1988? Yes, sir.
Dick Gephardt ran for president.
Dick Gephardt ran for president, so the legislature in Missouri thought it would be better if he could win a primary. So we had a primary that year, and we appropriated in the legislature money for that. But it costs money for primaries, so that's the next step that you have to think about. Even if you get the political parties in the state to say, yeah, we think it's a good idea to have a primary rather than a caucus, you have to get the legislature to agree. In Missouri, it costs between $5 and $7 million to run the presidential nominating process. For the primary, caucuses cost the state zero. That's a party cost. So there are all of these balances and constant sort of tensions between whether the parties have these responsibilities, whether the state has a responsibility, how much openness and democracy is it really? And the one possible solution that I wanted to just throw out on the table, and I'm sure others have some, is something that secretaries of state have come up with. It's called a rotating regional primary system, where the country is divided up in 4 regions, east, south, midwest, and west, that each 4 years, that whoever's first changes, and that those go from February, March, April, and May, and that in those regions, each of them goes a month. Iowa and New Hampshire are carved out to stay in the beginning, and that would let there be some uniformity and predictability in the process. So that's one of the things that is out there being debated this year. I'm supportive of that. And the takeaway, I guess, for y'all today is, as people who are spurring the public debate on these topics, is to that admonition in the environmentalist world of think globally and act locally. Because that's what we need to do here. We need to think about these issues of fairness, but act on them in our individual states to get this change really